What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Trey Codes. My name is Trey Hope, as always, and today I'll be discussing how to set up a backend API using both MongoDB and Google Cloud Functions. Now, MongoDB is a NoSQL database that's pretty popular on the web, which is similar to Firebase, and Google Cloud Functions is a way that we can upload our own Node.js functions to the web and use them right out of the box. So in conjunction with the two, we'll be able to set up our own backend for apps in the future. So it's going to be a lengthy project, but I'll be sure to cover everything in detail. That way you can start making some backends for your own applications in the future. So let's get started. All right, so the first thing that we need to do is head over to account.mongodb.com. It's reading cloud.mongodb.com here, but essentially this is MongoDB's website where you can actually monitor your database, monitor access, and a bunch of other things. So I already have a database here, so I won't recreate one essentially because it costs money to do so, but I'll just kind of go over the process on how to do so. So once you sign in, which is completely free, you want to go over here to create, and this is where you would create a database or a cluster. And so you would create a dedicated cluster. There's two other options. I'm not too sure what serverless or shared does, but mine was dedicated. And then you would pick your provider. I pick AWS just because they're pretty reliable. And then you need to pick a region wherever you are located. So it doesn't have to be exactly where you're located. I usually pick North Virginia, even though I was in Ohio, but you don't really want to pick something like Paris or Frankfurt, obviously, if you're in America. Then you'll scroll down and you'll see here, it has an option for cluster name. This is where you would name your cluster. It can really just be anything. For one of my apps, Critic, I just named it the Critic cluster and went from there. So after you create it, you'll hit create cluster, and then it takes about 7 to 10 minutes for it to actually create. So you just need to wait a little bit. But then once it's ready, you'll see it back here. And we have cluster 0. I guess I named it cluster 0. I didn't name it Critic. But, oh yeah, that's right. I named my database Critic, not the cluster. So yeah, it was just cluster 0. So then we would select the cluster. But actually with cluster 0 here, we need to hit connect. All right. So now we have the options to connect with MongoDB shell, connect your application, or connect using MongoDB Express. We want to hit connect your application. And so here you actually get the connection string. So I'm not going to show the password because if I did, then you'd have access to my entire database and I don't want that. But as you can see here, this is the connection string that we're going to need. So we'll copy this and save this for later. So just keep in mind that you really need this. It's very important. All right. And that is all we do for right now. In the next step, I'll show you how to actually use MongoDB Compass, which is a GUI for MongoDB. Now we need to open up our GUI, which is called MongoDB Compass, and I'll drop a link in the description on where you can actually download that, but it's a free application that allows us to actually mess with our database a little bit more easily than trying to do it on the website. So we'll open up MongoDB Compass. Take it a little second to initialize. We'll full screen this too. Whoops. Didn't work. Okay. All right. So as you can see here, we need to enter in that connection string that we copied a few minutes ago. So we'll go ahead and copy and paste. I have the wrong one. Let me just copy that again. There we go. All right. Copy and paste. And as you can see here, this is requiring the password. I'm going to go ahead and enter this password now, but I'm not going to show it. So give me 1 second. All right, so I entered in the password for the connection string. We are now in MongoDB Compass. So what we want to do now is create our database. So we'll go up here to create database and we will give it a name. For this example, I'm just going to create a database of, we'll just call it my database for now. I hate that name whenever I'm doing examples, but it's the best name I can go to right now. And then we're going to have a collection, which is essentially a collection of documents. So we're going to be adding people to a database. So we'll call this collection people. And then we will hit create database. And then as you can see here, we now have our database of people. There's no document in it just yet, but we're going to go ahead and get to that in just a little bit. In the next step, I'll show you how to create your project in Firebase. Now we head over to Firebase because this is where we will be setting up our Google Cloud Functions. Essentially that's tied in with some of the things that Firebase offers. So you don't have to go to Firebase to set up a Google Cloud Function, but this is where I do it just because it's a little bit easier and it just looks better when I'm working with my actual application. So we're going to create a Firebase project. So we'll go to console. As you can see here, here's some other apps that I already have, but we'll be making a new one today for the example. So we'll hit add project, and we'll call this one MongoDB demo. And we don't need Google Analytics for this project since we're just using the Google Cloud Functions. So then we'll hit create project. This takes a couple seconds to set up. All right, and now it says your new project is ready, so we'll hit continue. And here we are. Our MongoDB demo is now ready. And what we have to do is we go over to functions over here on the side. And in order to use Google Cloud Functions, you have to upgrade your project, the payment plan. So by default, the project is on the Spark plan, which is free, $0 a month. But in order to use functions, we need to upgrade it to the Blaze plan, which is pay as you go. So this is pretty much going to be charging for ability to extend your project with Google Cloud. So we'll hit select plan, purchase. All right, we're now upgraded. Now we can get started with Google Cloud Functions. And as you can see here, it's giving us directions on our next steps as far as how to install Google Cloud Functions for our app. So I'll explain more of that in detail in the next steps, but just know that we need to run 3 of these commands and then we're good to go. But in the meantime, I just want to show you, here's the dashboard for functions. And right now it says waiting for your first deploy. So in the next step, I'll show you how to actually create the project in VS Code. All right, now we need to create our project in VS Code. So what we want to do is I'm going to head over to my development folder where I keep all of my applications, create a new folder called MongoDB demo. And then I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to open up that folder I just created. So as you can see here, it's an empty folder. So what we need to do is run a few commands to get this going. So the first command that you saw previously was, not that far, npm install -g Firebase -tools. Whoops, I forgot. I have to run sudo commands on my Mac. That's embarrassing, but still haven't figured out how to give access to certain file directories on my Mac yet. So we'll let that run, give us everything that we need to run this application. All right, the next command we need to run is Firebase init. All right, so once we get here, it's gonna ask us, as you see here, it says Firebase, cool little visual. It says you're about to initialize a Firebase project in this directory. Which Firebase features do you want to set up for this directory? So it gives us a bunch of options, but all we need for today is functions. So we'll hit the space bar to select functions, then hit enter. Then it says, first let's associate this project directory with a Firebase project. You please select the option. So we're going to click use an existing project, and we're going to select the one that we just created in Firebase, MongoDB demo. We'll hit enter. All right. Then it says, what language would you like to use to write Cloud Functions? I usually just pick JavaScript. You can use TypeScript if you're well versed in that. So we'll hit JavaScript. And then, do you want to use ESLint to catch probable bugs and enforce style? Usually I would hit yes on this, but I'm going to select no, just for ease. That way it doesn't give me any errors if there's some simple syntax problems. So we'll hit no. And then, do you want to install dependencies with npm now? We'll hit yes, and we'll just let this run right now. All right, so as you can see now, in this MongoDB demo directory, we have our functions folder, as well as some other files below it. So now what we need to do is we need to go into the functions directory from the terminal, and we need to download the MongoDB package for our node function. So we need to run npm install MongoDB, and this will let us actually use MongoDB for our node functions. So as you can see here, this is an example function that you could use, just a simple one that says hello world, but this is essentially where we will be coding up our cloud functions. So in the next video, I'll show you how to code the CRUD functions, which is well, CRUD means create, read, update, and delete, but I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so now we need to go ahead and create our functions. So we need to come up here to the top first. Let me close this. And we need to create some imports first. So first we need to create a reference to the MongoDB client. And we do that by calling require MongoDB dot Mongo client. We also need to create an instance of this thing called object ID, which is the way that MongoDB references its documents in the collection. So you can add a normal ID, but by default you get an object ID on every document, and we need that when we're using our read and delete functions. So we'll go require MongoDB dot object ID. There we go. And we already have functions in here. We need that. Then we need to create the client, and we do that by calling Mongo client. We'll pass in the connection string, which was this. And before I deploy the functions, I will change this password to my password, but for now, I don't want you seeing that, so we'll just use this. And then we need to add some brackets, and then we need to have use new URL parser true, and use unified topology true. Did I spell that right? I think I did. Okay. All right, now we need to add our database name. You don't really have to do this, but I like it just to create a variable for my database name. And the database was my database, and then our collection name was people. All right, so now that we have that, we can delete this function. We don't need that. We're ready to create the first part of our CRUD operation. And as I mentioned before, CRUD, CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. So every database should have these 4 basic functions. Any database without one of those is not a real database, and therefore is lacking in that area. So the first function is called create person. So we'll call exports dot create person. Now the name of the function next to exports is what the name of the function will be in the Google Cloud. So make sure it's something that you can identify easily. So we'll call functions HTTPS on request, and it's an async function. So we'll add the async modifier and then pass in rec and res. So rec is how we get the actual properties that hit the endpoint, and then res is how we send the response back. So the response, so requirements and response. I believe that's what rec stands for. Don't quote me. All right, so we have our base of our function. Now we need to create the variables for this function. So when we create a person, we're going to pass the first name, last name, and age to the endpoint. So we'll call rec body first name. Same thing for last name, rec body last name, and then an age as well. Body age. All right. Now we need to create a try catch to make sure that if the endpoint doesn't work, we catch the error. So let's go ahead and write that catch out now. So if there's an error, we return the response and we send the error back. But if everything is good, we go ahead and connect our client. So we call client.connect. Client.connect. And first we see if there's an error with the connection as well. So if error, we throw an error. Otherwise, we go ahead and create a JSON object of our data to pass to the actual function. And that data is just going to be the first name, last name, and age. Now, first name and last name are both strings, but the age is going to be a number. So we need to call parse int on this to make sure that we convert it to a number. That way it doesn't show up as a string in our database. All right, so we have the data. Now we need to call client DB, pass in our database name. Then we need to call the collection of that database, and we'll pass in the collection name. And then we need to call this function called insert one. And what insert one is, it inserts one document to our database. So we'll pass in that data that we just created right here. And then we need to also check for errors when we submit that to the database. So we pass in the data, and then in our return function, we have an error, or we could have a variable right here like user or ID or something, but as long as we don't have an error, we just assume that the insertion was successful. So if error, just like above, throw an error. Otherwise return true to let us know that, hey, it was successful. So this right here is our function for create person. All right, now we need to go ahead, I'll move this out the way so we have more room. Now we need to code our function for reading a person. All right, and I'm going to copy and paste this code and just modify it a little bit just to save some time. All right, so when we read a person, we don't need the first name, last name, age anymore. All we need now is the ID of that person or that document, so to speak. All right, so we take out the data. All right, and now this time, instead of insert one, let me add a semicolon to that. Instead of insert one, what we want to call is find one. And what find one does is obviously it finds one document matching the criteria of the filter that we pass in. So the filter that we're going to be using is we want to find the ID, and be careful. The ID that we're looking for is underscore ID. So that's the ID of the document itself. If you pass in just ID, it's going to be looking for an ID property that you created, not the ID that it gave to the document. But I'll show that in a second. So we'll say ID, new object ID, and then pass in that ID that we got. So I know this is a little confusing, but the way it works is it looks for an object ID. Now, even though it says it's deprecated, it's still useful. I mean, it's still used, so don't worry about that. You can ignore that, but you're looking for the object ID of the ID that you sent. All right. So then our return function brings an error or a user, right? And just like before, if there's an error, we throw an error. Otherwise, what we want to return is the user itself. So instead of true like above, we want to return the user and its information. All right. Now we need to write our function for updating a user, or a person, I should say. So this time, when we update, we want to update based on first name, last name, and age as well, but we also need the ID to know which document that we're updating. All right, so instead of find one, what we want to do is update one. All right, we're going to update one document based on the ID, similar to up here. So we can actually just copy and paste this. All right, so we're updating that ID, and what we need to call is this function called set. And what set does is it sets those properties on that document to the ones that we specify right here. So we're going to say first name is going to be first name, last name, and then age, parse int age. All right, let me move these down a little bit so it's easier to view. All right, so we have that in there. Now we need to do our return function as well. So if there's an error, obviously we'll throw the error, but otherwise we can just return true, similar to the create function. So we'll go up top, copy and paste that. All right, so that's our update function. And finally, we need to write our delete function. Okay, so we'll say delete person. You know what? I wasn't changing the names of any of these. Let me go ahead and do that now. Delete person, update person, and read person. Okay, so for our delete person, all we need is the ID. So really, we can kind of copy and paste this read one. That'd probably be a little bit easier. All right, so we have the ID. So instead of calling find one, all we need to do is call delete one. And this means that we'll be deleting one document from the collection based on that ID. All right. As always, if there's an error, throw an error. Otherwise, if it's deleted successfully, we return true. All right, so this is all of our CRUD operations. Now what we want to do is deploy this to Firebase. Okay, so we need to open up our terminal again. All right, and now we want to call Firebase deploy. So this is going to deploy all these functions to the Google Cloud. So you see here, we're going to let that run, give it a few seconds. Required. Oh, typo. Only required. Try that again. All right. So after a couple minutes, you can see here that it says we had a successful deploy, all of our functions. So if we go over to functions in Firebase, hit refresh, we can now see we have all four of our functions: the create, delete, read, and update. So that's all it is to actually get the functions uploaded. Now in the next video, we'll go ahead and test each endpoint. All right, so now that we have our Google Cloud Functions uploaded, we now need to test these endpoints, and I use a extension in VS Code called Thunder Client. It's free to download and it integrates very well with VS Code, so I'll be using this instead of Postman today. So to test our first function, we need to go to Google Cloud Functions in Firebase and copy that endpoint for a create person. So this is the first request that we'll be testing. So we'll paste that endpoint in. I'm going to scoot this over a little bit so we can see the full URL. And then we'll close this. It needs to be a post because all of our methods are a post method. And for the headers, we have to add content type. Oops. And then application, what is it? URL. Here we go. So this is just how the endpoint reads, what type of data you're sending. You could pass in JSON as well if you were using JSON for the body, but for me, I'll be using form and code, so we'll use that one. All right, so the first thing we need to add is the first name, which is Trey. Last name, Hope, and then the age, 29. So we'll hit send, we get back true. And if we come over to our database, hit refresh, we now see that we have our first document with the object ID, first name, last name, and age. So as I mentioned earlier, that object ID is added by default, so you don't even have to worry about adding IDs for your documents, which makes it very easy. The next part of our endpoint we need to test is the read function. So we'll copy that endpoint, paste it in here. And we need to pass in an ID this time. And the ID is going to be that object ID on our document. So we'll add that to the ID and we'll turn off age, last name, and first name because since we're using the read, all we need is the ID. And as you can see here, we get back that document that we just saw. The next one we need to test is the update function. So we'll come in here, paste that. And we'll turn these back on because we want to update the first name to be Trayvon, the last name to be Johnson, and then we'll go 2 years in the future and I'll be 31. And we'll use the ID to specify which document we're updating. So we'll hit send, get back true. And if we refresh our database, we now see that the first name is now Trayvon Johnson, age 31. The last one we need to test is the delete function. So we'll come in here, paste that, turn these off again because just like the read function, all we need is the ID for the delete function. So we'll hit send, get back true, refresh, and now there's no data. So all of our CRUD functions work properly, and this is essentially how you set up an API backend using MongoDB and Google Cloud Functions in Firebase. All right, so hopefully you got a better understanding of how to use both together to make a backend. I only went over 4 of the functions today. There's a lot more that MongoDB offers, such as listing documents, sorting documents, filtering documents, and things like that. But you get the gist of how to actually start working with MongoDB as the backend via Google Cloud Functions. So as always, if this video was helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and always hit me up if you have any other ideas for what you would like me to discuss in my next video. Until then, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.